Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our next episode of Topics in Neurorehabilitation presented by Robotics. I'm Jill Butler, and today we'll be talking with Kyle Whaley, owner, executive director, and practicing clinician at Propel Physiotherapy. Kyle graduated from Queen's University Physical and Health Education Program in 1998 and began his career in strength and conditioning with an active population, including athletes from a variety of sports. After graduating from the physical therapy program at the University of Toronto in 2002, he began his career working in spinal cord injury at Lyndhurst Centre. Kyle's passion for working with niche populations, neurological, and sports injuries helped him realize the opening of a private clinic in 2011 dedicated to the treatment of these types of conditions. And in 2016, expansion into a larger treatment facility saw the creation of Propel Physiotherapy. Kyle is also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto in the Department of Physical Therapy. He spends his downtime with his wife and two boys on the ice, bike, water, ski hill, or out in the woods. His talk today covers neuroplasticity, adjusting your practice to achieve optimal outcomes. Hi, Kyle. It's good to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jill.
Kyle, I'm really looking forward to your talk because maximizing our ability to tap into neuroplasticity principles during our rehab treatments is such a hot topic in the field right now. To our viewers, we'd love to hear from you as well on this topic. What are some of the interventions you employ in your practice to enhance neuroplastic changes in your patients with neurologic conditions? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below also. And don't forget to like and subscribe this video if you want to hear more talks like this one. And with that, Kyle, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Jill. It's a picture of me on a couple of years ago. Sadly, not more hair, but less. As you mentioned, Jill, I'm the executive director and owner of Propel Physiotherapy. We're a private physiotherapy company in the Greater Toronto Area, and we do a number of things, but really our niche or specialty is the treatment of neurological conditions, brain injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, and certainly some complex orthopedic injuries. And we have a host of other complementary therapy that keeps us going. I'd like to start with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Everyone can appreciate this, especially as clinicians. We're in the business of helping people, and the injustice in healthcare, which we're certainly experiencing up here in Canada, is real. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll talk a little bit about some of the definitions around plasticity or neuroplasticity or brain plasticity. I'll use those interchangeably. I'm going to talk about some of the structures and mechanisms involved and some of the key factors. And we'll talk about some physiotherapy, some evidence-based options that can be implemented into your practice. And I've got some great case studies that I'd like to present, but I suspect we're not going to have time today. And so Jill and I spoke, and hopefully we're going to put those on another session after. This is not an original thought or quote, and I've pulled it from a colleague's presentation, but we use this often in our practice, that the brain influences the body and the body influences the brain. And hopefully I'll get that across in the talk today. There's a number of things we can do on both ends to help the brain and the body. And I'm going to give you some ideas on how we can get the best out of both. This is an interesting thought from Dobkin in 1993, which is a long time ago, but isn't at the same rate. The potential for some restoration after injury, probably being the key word, lies within the anatomic and physiologic reorganization of cortical, subcortical, and spinal circuits that control motor output. So if we think, certainly more than 30 years ago, the concept of neuroplasticity was much different then. We were pretty sure that the brain didn't change a lot after once you got into adulthood, or couldn't change. And we know that's not the case now. And if we fast forward, we just look at 11 years ahead, Will et al. Describes this. Brain plasticity is a term which refers to the capacity of the system to achieve new functions by transforming on a longer term basis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, by the early 2000s, we had a good handle on the fact that there was an opportunity to change the structure and function of the brain through neuroplasticity. And I'm going to add in, it's not always adaptive. The buzzwords these days are adaptive and maladaptive, certainly up here in Canada in the neurological literature and clinical arena. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So a good chunk of the evidence for neuroplasticity, and this is by no means exhaustive, comes from transcranial magnetic stimulation, PET scans, fMRI. And what we've been able to do is really map different areas of the brain, how they're functioning before and after treatments, before and after neurological conditions. And we've been able to measure what happens after motor learning using motor evoked potentials and see the change in the cortical representation or representation in the brain. And some examples of that would be, certainly what happens after spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, the sensory and motor cortexes of, a complete paraplegia for the lower extremities look different, and they start to be taken over by different areas that are still functioning. So the trunk and upper extremity. Braille readers have a much, larger representation, if you can imagine, you can get it for the hand and certainly fingers. And amputees, the area that was once represented the lost limb is we know is taken over by other areas. Hand dominance is another one. I happen to be left-handed, and so the right side of my brain is going to be significantly more involved. We think of neuroplasticity, and certainly this is the way I was taught, as a longer-term adaptation to a stress or a change on the system. I'm going to try and talk about it in a little bit more global sense. In some of the information I've got, I'll reference in a little bit, but Dr. Boyd from out of British Columbia here in Canada. She's a physiotherapist and a PhD and a researcher. She has a great TED Talk. I've linked it in a little bit, but she talks about the short-term, in minutes and hours, neurochemical changes that are responsible for improving the ability to complete a task. We tend to think of neuroplasticity a little bit more structural changes that are longer term in the weeks and months, but she certainly introduces the idea that there are short-term changes, and those are neurochemical and neurotransmitter changes. Longer term, weeks to months, we're looking at cortical reorganization, synaptogenesis, long-term potentiation, axonal and dendritic sprouting. Again, this is not always positive, and can certainly be maladaptive. And if we think of stuff that's maladaptive that inhibits recovery and function, one of the early things I think about is I work in spinal cord injury as some of my early training, and neuropathic pain is probably an example of a maladaptive neuroplasticity. The thought is there's the afferent fibers, there's afferent sprouting that's connected to interneurons in the spinal cord that are facilitating or modulating or upregulating some of the negative signals that are coming from below the level of lesion or at the level of lesion that would normally be downtrained or would not continue in a short-term injury like twisting your ankle or something. Hyperreflexia, there's a school of thought that also feels that certainly hyperreflexia after a traumatic brain injury and stroke, or certainly spinal cord injury, is a result of a mechanism of repair. And I think that's how we really need to think about it. You know, when the central nervous system's damaged, whether it's the brain, you know, or subcortical structures such as the midbrain and spinal cord injury, there are cascades of events that happen, and they're different in the, you know, they're different in the spinal cord than they are in the peripheral nervous system, and then certainly up in the cortex. I've included the link on the bottom here. This is a good infographic of some of the rerouting and sprouting that can happen, and we talk about that's responsible, or we think contributes to neuroplasticity. So signals, depending on the stimulation or the, you know, how the system is stimulated, it will adapt to the change in function. Neuroplasticity, this is from Chen in 2002. We've got a good idea that neuroplasticity happens in all parts of the central nervous system: cortex, thalamus, brainstem, and spinal cord. And certainly those of you work in spinal cord injury, you know, would understand, and certainly we're trying to tap into neuroplasticity with some of the treatment methods that we do use. This is the quote from Dr. Lara Boyd that I mentioned from a TEDx talk in Vancouver in 2015. And I really like this because it describes the three important components. Neuroplasticity is supported by chemical, structural, and by functional changes, and these are happening across the whole brain. This is not an exhaustive list, but when I think of my approach to treatment of neurological injuries, you know, there's a number of factors that I want to influence, including the timing, the novelty of what we're doing, intensity. I put some asterisks beside stuff that I certainly think clinically, in my experience, you can get more bang for your buck, but that's certainly open to debate, and I'm happy to discuss it at some point. Duration, specificity, these are components of motor learning that as a clinician, we all are certainly familiar with. And salient or saliency. So timing, early and often, we want to mitigate these maladaptive pathways. I think in Canada, a good example is our post-stroke treatment, such as the nature of healthcare. And certainly in Canada here, we've cut back on our lengths of stay. And so we're seeing our stroke population being discharged home or, you know, rehab earlier and earlier, and then discharged home from rehab earlier and earlier when the resolution of the initial stroke has not even occurred. So, you know, we're sending them home without a comprehensive and consistent follow-up, and that gives the opportunity for atypical movements, compensations that, you know, the nervous system responds to whatever you give it. It doesn't matter if it's going to help you or harm you, it's going to reinforce what you do the most. So if you're on your way home without follow-up and your movement patterns are not conducive to getting you in the right direction, then that will continue to reinforce itself. Novelty. So consider in your practice new tasks and new skills. An example that we use often, and I find really beneficial, is treadmill training. I have clients kind of post-stroke, post-spinal cord injury, and traumatic brain injury who have actually never been on a treadmill. And it perturbs them. It's very difficult to be on, but we certainly make it safe. And it's a great opportunity to introduce a novel task and have their system adapt. The intensity, I talk about the 24-hour rule here. You see a client for an hour during the day. Let's say maybe it's an hour and a half during an intense treatment session. when you send them home, what are they doing for the other 23 hours? So you really want to make sure that you've set up the program that they're doing at home that taps into that intensity. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more and show a couple of videos. And duration can mean a number of things, and that should also include, the duration or frequency of what you're doing. I use the example of quote unquote healthy individuals. If we want people to make a change to either their fitness or their health, we know that doing something twice a week will help you remain status quo and not improve. 3 times a week, you're going to get some improvements, but above 3 times a week, so 4, 5, 6 times a week, you're going to get greater improvements. That's in a population with an unleasoned nervous system. I think as my practice has gone on, I've realized that I don't know how we can expect people who have a lesion to their nervous system to get better if we're seeing them once, maybe twice, sometimes 3 times a week. So, and I'll speak to that more, but I really think on the intensity and duration, we're missing the boat on this. We need to be seeing our neurological population, certainly after they've been discharged from rehab. And again, we know neuroplasticity, we can harness or tap into this. It doesn't matter if you're 2 years or 20 years post. We can certainly tap into that. There are other factors that go into this, but really the intensity is really important. And something to think about, and we do this sometimes, is we will bring clients in for 3 to 5 times a week, and sometimes we'll do twice a days, and really push them, and sometimes that's when we see the greatest results. The specificity, this is relatively straightforward, and you don't get better juggling by playing the piano. So it's important that you're working on tasks that you're trying to get better. Now, there is some carryover, and that's a whole nother topic of kind of motor learning, but that's carryover from one task to the next. Saliency, make it relevant to the client. So if the client never if the client isn't interested in reaching overhead to grab something out of the cupboard because reaching up into the cupboard and grabbing stuff wasn't their thing, they always had it on a level, they don't need to reach over their head, well, then there's no point in drilling that into them. I've got an interesting story, the saliency that really hit home for me. I had a client a handful of years ago, and they came in, and they were English was not their first language. They'd come from another country, and as a good physiotherapist, I was determined to improve their independence in their kind of mobility and self-care to be able to take care of themselves. And I set up a treatment program, and I worked with them 3-4 times a week for 6 to 8 weeks. And they made some improvements, but not really the improvements that I would have expected. And their son came in at the end of the 6 or 8 weeks that we were working with them. We were having a discussion, and I said, it's amazing. Your parent did really well, but I really think they could have done. We didn't get the improvements we expected. He said, well, I see you're working on the goal to improve their independence. And as I dug a little deeper, and the son let me know, was that in their culture, as you get older, being independent is never a goal. They expect the children and the extended family to help them out. So it really hit home to me. It was a wake up call to make sure that the goals that we're setting as a treatment team, you certainly include the client and make sure they're relevant to the client. Some of the treatment options that I like to use and are certainly supported in the literature, constraint-induced movement therapy. Physiotherapists, all of us certainly should hear about this. This is some of the early work done on monkeys by Taub, and we don't use this at our clinic, but I have colleagues that use it in the city. It's very intense and can be very challenging, but certainly the results it yields are excellent, and they're unrefutable, and there's some great literature on that. Body weight support treadmill training, we use this on a regular basis, and there's some great literature out there. It's an opportunity to practice tasks over a treadmill in a safe environment. There's and we'll talk about this a little bit on kind of when to use that, and I'll give an example, and I got a video coming up. Robotic assisted gait training is another great opportunity. We have a robotic assisted device that augments what the client already does, and we find this is an excellent tool to allow the neurological population, so brain injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, to achieve a volume and repetition of movement that would otherwise not be possible over ground, given most of the current limitations of the clients that we see. And that's the challenge of our neurological condition, isn't it? We're trying to set up an environment where our clients can experience the environment and a sensory enriched environment without driving a lot of it cortically, because we know gait or walking and most of our movement is not driven by the cortex. It's the basic pattern is housed in the lumbar spine, central pattern generator. Normal movement I described, this is a treatment approach we use, a bull bath or NDT. There's some literature, but not a lot. And exercise. This is our go-to, and it should be everybody's go-to. The evidence for exercise and how it primes the brain and nervous system for learning is incredible. I'll talk about robotic assisted gait training here. What we think is that increasing the volume of appropriate walking, really we're able to tap into some of the non-cognitive elements of walking, specifically the central pattern generator, which I mentioned is housed in the lumbar spine. I'll talk a little bit about more, but we know that also repetition is the key to motor learning. So what we want to get is high reps of high quality movement. And then we certainly want to incorporate goals that are functional, salient, and relevant to the environment. I hope this is going to play. Here's an example. I'll present this case on the next presentation that I do, but here's a client of ours. He's a young fella that had a stroke. He's in a robotic assisted device over a treadmill, and he's in the body weight support harness. And again, this allows us to get not worry about one's safety. So we don't have to worry about, we had this gentleman over the treadmill without the body weight support. I'm down at the foot, and he did happen to fall or slip or lose his balance. It would be a dicey situation, and he'd end up off the back of the treadmill. So I'm just going to play the video, and you can have a quick peek of this. And what I'm working on here, we talk about volume of appropriate movement. I'm trying to ensure appropriate limb loading, and this client, that he achieves heel strike on initial contact with his more affected limb, or the left side. Okay, let's talk about exercise. The amazing thing about exercise is that it has immediate effects on the brain, and we're talking as soon as you start doing it. I'm going to highlight a couple of things. It's not an exhaustive list. This is especially important for our TBI, traumatic brain injury clients. creating, an environment-rich brain after it's, been damaged is super, super important. So we know BDNF is a pretty, it's a buzzword certainly in our community up here these days, and we know the beneficial effects of cognition and the ability to enhance neurogenesis, so synaptic plasticity. This is exactly what we're trying to get through. This is part of neuroplasticity, and it's the basis of learning. So learning both cognitively and learning from a functional point of view, and this is really the connection between the brain and the rest of the body. So if we can prime the brain for learning through physical function, it is just amazing. And again, I'll present some case studies on our next presentation. I'll show you some how we really think we've been able to tap into that. And we know that exercise immediately alters the concentration of BDNF and IGF and endothelial growth factors. These are all things that neurochemicals and processes that create and enhance, create an appropriate environment for neuroplasticity. And the last point here, Monteggi et al., it goes well into adulthood. So that's really important to remember. I mean, we've made great improvements with clients that are 10, 15, 20 years post-stroke who are older adults in their 60s and 70s. Alsace et al., I really like this infographic of the kind of cascade or benefits of exercise at different levels. So there's certainly, and they're referring here, to both cognitive and motor function. So BDNF, here's some of the growth factors we've just talked about, what's happening at a cellular level, and then structural and functional changes, increased neural activity, there's receptor activity. And that goes back to Dr. Laura Boyd's point that, there's 3 levels that this is happening, and it's really important to understand that. We've got neurochemical changes that are immediately happening in neuroplasticity. We've got structural changes in the different levels of the nervous system that take a little bit more time. And in turn, those turn into really functional changes. And it's important to also see this out. And what I mean by that is, it's obviously quite dependent on funding, and it's the way it works up in Canada here is it's really dependent on how you're injured. If you're injured in a car versus injured at work, or you just slip and fall at your home, is really determines what sort of training you're going to get after you're discharged from rehab. And really, you could be 2-3 months post-injury and end up at home with no therapy or no access to funds for therapy. And that is really where we think a good chunk of the changes start to really be made. And it depends obviously on what type of injury you are and, a number of other circumstances. Ongoing other benefits of exercise, it changes your mood. It's good for weight control. We know it's great to control a lot of risk factors that neurological injuries predispose us to. So spinal cord injury, stroke, makes us more at risk for heart disease, depression, anxiety, some of the psychosocial changes that happen, and it increases the body's relaxation response. From physio or physical therapists, this is old hat for us. We know the benefits of exercise. It's really putting those into practice. And this is just a schematic of neurogenesis. And, that we like to also use the term chronic moderate exercise. It's really important that every single treatment, I try and some type of aerobic activity if possible. I'll give you some ideas up here on stuff we can do. This is just a wrap up on what happens to your brain when you're exercising. And it doesn't have to be structured. We like to think of things that are really structured, but I think it's really important to give people options, especially after brain and spinal cord injury, accessibility issues, your mobility's changed. Get out and do anything you can do. That could be a virtual class in your chair, so your wheelchair or sitting in a chair. There's lots of adaptive movement classes you can do. So what we do is we work with what kind of parts of your body are going. That may involve using a leg ergometer or an arm ergometer, dance, wheeling, biking, yoga, tobogganing, playing with your children. Get out and just get moving. And that's it for today.
Thanks, Kyle, for such a great overview of an incredibly important topic. I know our viewers will want to learn more, so I just wanted to ask you a few follow-up questions. First one, can you speak a little bit more about the importance of tapping into the central pattern generators when it comes to gait training in patients with neurologic conditions?
Yeah, for sure. The thought on the central pattern generator, are there a number of environmental situations that we really tap into it. So feeding into it is heel strike and initial contact, and that's really important. So appropriate, excuse me, appropriate limb loading. And so heel strike, appropriate limb loading, hip extension. So the stretch, can we get the step on the contralateral limb long enough to end up getting toe off and getting a stretch of the anterior capsule and hip flexors? The thought is that all gives appropriate information back into this central pattern generator. And again, the way I think of it, Jill, is the challenge of walking after a neurological injury is it becomes cognitive. We have to think about it. Our clients are picking up their foot and placing it on the ground. They're picking it up and placing it on the ground. And sadly, that's not how we, walk when we don't have a lesion to our nervous system. We just get up and we go to stand up from the couch, walk to the fridge, open, grab a beer or a coffee or whatever we're doing at the time and turn around, come back, and we never think about it. So I think, in the example, a video I showed over the treadmill is we're trying to get an appropriate, the other thing really tapping into the central pattern generator is speed. We need to hit a speed appropriate enough and safe enough. Again, we're walking somewhere between, well, it depends, but 1 and 1.2 meters per second. The point is, if we're going too slow, the work of walking increases. Walking's it's a controlled fall. We let our center of gravity come over our base of support and we play catch up. Again, that doesn't happen after a neurological condition. So what we're doing on the treadmill is we're trying to get speed up. We're trying to get appropriate limb loading, get their pelvis over that more affected limb. If they were happen to be a stroke like the client I showed, we're getting heel strike, and then we're getting a step length that's long enough on the other side that allows us to get that affected trailing limb behind.
Love it. Very eloquently said. Well, thanks, Kyle, for a really great talk. And thank you also for your time.
Thanks, Jill. It was my pleasure.
And to our viewers, we hope you have been finding these talks interesting and helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video using the buttons below. And feel free also to use the comment section to suggest future talks that you'd like to see. We hope you tune in with us again next episode. Take care, everyone.